I believe that a knowledge and understanding of what Johnston called essential form provides a sound, disciplined bedrock from which all lettering can spring. This solid foundation enables a freedom for individual development. Now, I think there's actually a misunderstanding about what freedom is. So many people feel that they want to be free because they see freedom as needing no foundation, no boundaries, there's no restrictions. But actually the opposite is true. Real freedom comes from that discipline. Not least really the discipline of mental and physical practice. So there's no substitute for working, not necessarily hours and hours of endless practicing the letter O, but the actual business of making and doing and refining your work practice, refining the way you do things, learning more about how you make the letters, how you think about the letters. I think also there's a very important part is actually looking at letter forms, spending time to look at written letters, to look at drawn letters, to look what other people do, and also historical examples as well. Now the essential forms, the skeletons, will show me if I want to make an E, that is a good starting point for a letter E. But if I want to make a letter that has thick parts and thin parts, for example this E in the Trajan inscription, I need to know more than the basic form of the letter. I need to know how to put weight, how to put flesh on the bones of the letter. And this is where a knowledge of calligraphy comes in, an understanding of how calligraphic letters are made with an edged tool. And the writer of this inscription was using an edged tool to form his letters before they were carved, to map out the letters onto the stone. And an understanding of how that tool works is the basis of all good lettering. It is my opinion that the best lettering artists, be they letter carvers, type designers or sign writers, those who produce the most successful work are those who actually have an understanding of calligraphy at the root of their work. So if I'm going to write an E, then I want to put weight on the letter. I've got two pens tied together here, which are actually making overlapping skeleton forms. But I'm holding the pens, or the tool that this is, in a particular way, so that I make a letter that will have a thick stem and thinner crossbars. Now at the moment that doesn't actually look anything as refined as that, but it is the beginning of how the letters have the thick and thin parts. So look at the R. Again, if I make a skeleton R, I know that that's the shape. I have my circular bowl with the tail coming off that. If I then take an edged tool, I can translate that into a letter that has thick and thin parts. But I'm holding the pen, the tool, in this case 2 pens tied together, at a particular angle, a consistent angle. And that is giving me the thick and thin parts to the letter. So that when I take an edged tool here, in this case just a felt tip with an edge to it, you can see more clearly where the thick and thin parts are. Here's an R. And that's giving me thin parts in a specific place, there and in there, and thicker parts in other places, there, there and there. Now if I didn't have that knowledge of what an edged pen does, and I wanted to do an R, I'm kind of foxed really as my skeleton, but where am I going to put the thicks and thins of that letter without knowing the conventions? I might put them in an odd place. I might have a very thick part there and a thin part down there, and maybe a thick part up there and a thin part there. And what happens is that I produce a letter that visually is, it's a very rough sketch there, but visually is not stable, is not balanced, and it can look most uncomfortable. It doesn't look a particularly beautiful letter. But if I know that where the thicks and thins go conventionally, then when I start to draw a letter, then I have something to begin with in my mind. So I know that that stroke there, downstroke, is thicker than the part where the bowl joins the upright stroke, and I know that the bowl there has a thickness to it. That comes in thinner there, and my tail of the R comes out there. And then I can actually choose to develop that and change that in ways that I want to. I put the serifs on, and the serif is influenced by what a pen does. So if you're writing with a pen, and this is a felt tip, so that the constant supply of ink comes without any problem. But if you're using a dip pen, then you would need to actually move the pen to lead into the stroke, so that the ink starts to flow as it comes down into the stroke, and likewise as it comes out of a stroke, it creates a little serif. And so when I'm drawing a letter or painting a letter, I'm thinking of that as I do it. That's what a pen does. So as I come down to this stroke, I can add a serif at the beginning and end of the stroke, and I'm thinking too, and this is something that comes after quite a lot of experience, is I'm actually thinking too of whereabouts, and as on my pencil, this is exactly how I would draw a letter. I'm sketching it, I'm thinking in my mind where the weight should be, and how far up this letter the thickest part should be, up the bowl, sorry, that the thick part should be. Is it exactly in the middle, or is it maybe towards the top there? And what informs me where that thickest part should be is actually what the pen does. and specifically at the angle that the pen is held at. So if I hold a pen very flat to the writing line, I'm going to get a particular shape and look to my letter. If I hold it at a slight angle, in this case about 30 degrees, then I'm going to get a slightly different balance of weight. See how in this one, with the pen held as flat as possible, anyway it's changed a little bit there, then my thinnest point is there, my thickest point is across the strokes there. With the pen held at around about 30 degrees, then my thickest point comes there. See? About 30 degrees with that. And that changes, and if you look at the internal shape, that changes what's happening inside as well. So when I say that I look at the internal spaces and the space around the letter, that's what I'm looking at, the bowls of the letter there. And all this is about an understanding of calligraphy and the way that the edged pen works. I understood the importance of these letters, and he looked at them, looked at their proportions, and conveyed the importance to his students. I learnt them through the teaching of Anne Camp, who I suppose formalised them in a very easy way, and related everything back to the geometric proportions and the starting point of a circle within a square. Now, these skeleton letters are something that I look at very regularly when I'm teaching. I always begin with these, and then when I'm thinking in my own work, I have these at the forefront of my mind. The letters that I choose to use may not look like these at the end result. They may be tall and thin, like this kind of thing, or this kind of thing where they're very tall, narrow letters, or they may be wider and more rounded. But the understanding that I have from knowing these geometric proportions and geometric diagrams actually informs letters of all shapes, sizes, and all sorts of variations that I use. Generally speaking, I begin with text, and I think about the kind of letters that I want to use to communicate what it is that I want to say. Now, having said that, I think about the letters. Indeed, each piece of work has letters that are uniquely designed for the work, but my starting point is always goes back to these letters of Roman inscriptions, particularly the Trajan column, and the geometric proportions that underline these monumental capitals from Rome. So I have the information from the knowledge of the skeleton capitals in my mind. Having said that, every time I look at those, go back to looking at those, or go back to teaching them, I learn something different. You can never know everything there is to know about them, but I have that very firmly in my mind and in my mind's eye, so that when I come to draw letters for a piece of work, I'm referring back to that information. As I said, I'm not necessarily aiming to turn out Roman letters, but the knowledge and the information of related forms, how round letters relate together, how rectangular letters relate together, and how each letter will look with its neighbour, and the spacing, all that information is in my mind. And so when I come to design a piece of work, this for example is a drawing for the initial drawing for a piece of work, a hanging of painted letters, and I literally pick up a pencil and I begin sketching and drawing. These letters down here are very roughly sketched with a pencil to give me an idea of the kind of forms I want, the spacing, the shapes, and the how big or how weighty they're going to be, and then I go over that with the pencil and work on it more and more. And as I'm writing each letter, then I will be thinking about its neighbour, its the space inside and around the letters, how they're going to look, the little bits and pieces, the features of the letter, the serifs, and thicknesses, and thin parts, thick parts, and space between the lines, all those things that every calligrapher thinks about. Often a pen will do a lot of that work for you, and maybe I'll talk about that in a minute, more about that in a minute, but the pencil allows a certain amount of freedom actually to think aloud, but it isn't actually possible without the knowledge of the form underneath the letters. And this was something that I think Johnston realised very well, and perhaps was one of the greatest things that he passed on, was his understanding of how letters related together. How then have Johnston's theories helped me in my own work? Well, aside from the actual business of letter form, perhaps one of the biggest and most important things that I've learned from Johnston is to make real things, and one of the best ways of doing that, I think, is especially in small scale pieces of work where you can handle the work itself, you can engage with the words, you can engage with the materials that are used, and you can become involved with the piece. Some small pieces of work here. We have these small pebbles that were found on the beach on Holy Island, and using those as a vehicle for the lettering. This book made of cloth, a needle book, and the lettering goes behind the needles, was really designed, or came from the starting point of thinking about a book that could actually be used, that had a purpose, not just to be read, but that was able to be used. And then a small book here made quite spontaneously and informally on handmade paper, where the letters were painted directly onto the pages with very little planning. And as I worked, I was thinking very carefully, bringing into play all that I knew about calligraphic letters, about space, about page design, all those fundamentals that were in my head and in my mind and experience fitting together to make a piece of work that can be handled and looked at and engaged with.